Those flowers are probably more appropriate for someone in your situation. That was the first thing my daughter-in-law said to me at my husband's funeral, and somehow, it hurt more than watching the casket disappear behind the velvet curtains an hour later. Vanessa stood in front of me, wearing a tailored black designer dress that probably cost more than my first car back in 1974, holding out a tiny bouquet of grocery store carnations, while every other floral arrangement in the room looked like it had been flown in from Manhattan that morning. White orchids, imported lilies, roses the size of dinner plates. But the flowers she handed me looked thin, tired, and discounted, wrapped in cloudy plastic with a crooked silver ribbon. I stared at them for a moment before taking them gently into my hands. "Thank you," I said quietly. Vanessa smiled the way people do when they think they've already won. "I just figured," she continued softly, glancing at my old black coat. "With Harold gone now, simpler might feel more comfortable for you." Around us, people pretended not to hear. Wealthy people are experts at pretending. The funeral home in Greenwich was filled wall to wall with polished shoes, whispered conversations, and expensive sympathy. Men Harold had golfed with for 30 years shook hands near the marble fireplace, while women with diamond earrings touched my arm for exactly 3 seconds each before moving on to someone more important. I could feel their eyes drifting back toward Vanessa every few minutes, because she looked like the grieving widow people expected to see. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect posture. Meanwhile, I looked like what I actually was, a 67-year-old woman who hadn't slept in 4 nights. My son Ethan barely looked at me when I approached him near the front row. "Mom," he muttered quickly before checking his phone again. Vanessa touched his arm and whispered something that made him nod. Then she looked directly at me and said, "We reserved the family seating up front, but there's a quieter section in the back that might be easier for you." Easier for me. Like I was fragile. Like I was some elderly guest they needed to manage. Before I embarrassed them, I looked past her toward the front row where she had seated herself beside Ethan in the place where I had sat next to Harold for 42 years. I still said nothing. That seemed to irritate her more than anger would have. People become uncomfortable when humiliation doesn't get the reaction they expected. So I simply walked to the back row alone and sat quietly beneath the dim chandelier while strangers filled the seats around me. From there, I watched my husband's funeral like an outsider watching someone else's life. And then I noticed the watch on Vanessa's wrist. Gold Rolex. Champagne face. Custom diamond bezel. Harold bought that watch 3 Christmases ago after Vanessa cried at dinner claiming she had never owned anything truly luxurious before marrying into the family. But Harold hadn't paid for it. I had. Just like I had paid for nearly everything else they thought belonged to them. The service ended just after noon, and within 20 minutes the entire funeral home transformed from grief into networking. People who had been wiping tears during the eulogy were suddenly laughing softly beside trays of shrimp cocktails and glasses of champagne in the reception hall next door. Harold used to hate that part of wealthy Connecticut culture. He once told me funerals in our town felt more like country club mixers with darker clothing. Standing alone near the coffee station, I realized he had been right all along. I watched Ethan move from group to group, shaking hands like he was accepting a business award instead of mourning his father. Vanessa stayed glued to his side, touching his arm every few seconds, smiling sadly at investors, neighbors, and family friends as though she had already inherited Harold's entire identity. Not once did either of them ask whether I had eaten or whether I needed anything. A waiter passed by carrying silver trays of appetizers, and before I could reach for one, Vanessa appeared beside me again. "Careful," she said with a tight smile. "Those have shellfish. At your age, it is probably safer not to risk upsetting your stomach." I looked at her calmly. "I have eaten lobster longer than you have been." "Alive, Vanessa." Her smile twitched for half a second before she laughed softly like I had made a charming little joke. Then she leaned closer. "People are worried about you," she whispered. "You know Harold handled everything financially. Ethan and I just want to make sure you are realistic about what comes next." There it was again. That word. Realistic. Rich people love using soft words when they are preparing to strip someone of dignity. I said nothing. Silence unsettles cruel people because they cannot measure how much damage they are actually doing. Vanessa eventually drifted away toward a group near the fireplace, where several women immediately surrounded her. I could hear pieces of the conversation floating across the room. She is being so strong. Poor Ethan. So much responsibility now. Responsibility. As if my son had suddenly become caretaker to some helpless widow instead of speaking about the woman who built his entire life beside his father. A few minutes later, I walked toward the dining area and stopped when I saw place cards arranged across the long reception table. Ethan and Vanessa sat in the center beside Harold's business partners. The family section stretched around them with embossed cream cards and gold lettering. My name was not there. At first, I thought perhaps it had been misplaced. Then I noticed a tiny round table pushed near the back windows beside the catering station. One chair, one place setting, one folded card that read Margaret Whitmore. I stared at it quietly while guests passed behind me pretending not to notice. Vanessa approached carrying a champagne flute. "Oh good," she said brightly. "You found your seat. We thought you might appreciate somewhere quieter away from all the business conversations." Business conversations. About the company Harold and I started in a one-car garage outside Cleveland when Ethan was still in diapers. I remember sleeping beside stacks of unpaid invoices while Harold worked 18-hour days trying to keep the lights on. I remember cashing out my mother's retirement bonds to make payroll during the recession in 1998. I remember every sacrifice. But standing there in that glittering Connecticut reception hall, none of those memories mattered to them anymore. To Ethan and Vanessa, I was simply old now, disposable, expensive to maintain. An aging widow they assumed had spent her life standing beside wealth instead of quietly creating it. By 7 that evening, the reception crowd had finally thinned enough for people to stop pretending they were there for emotional support. The real conversations had started. Small circles formed throughout the Whitmore estate living room while crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the chandelier Harold imported from Italy 20 years ago. I sat alone near the windows with a cup of untouched coffee while guests wandered through the house admiring paintings and antiques they suddenly spoke about, as though they belonged to the past instead of the present. Nothing changes people faster than the belief that someone powerful is no longer in the room. I noticed it first when Harold's younger brother Richard walked into his office without asking permission. He opened cabinets, glanced through framed photos, and even ran his fingers across Harold's mahogany desk like he was mentally measuring where his own things might go someday. An hour earlier, he had been crying into a handkerchief beside the casket. Now he looked like a man touring real estate. Across the room, Vanessa lowered her voice while speaking to 2 women from the country club, but not low enough. "Honestly, I do not even know what shape the finances are in," she sighed dramatically. "Harold spent money like crazy toward the end." One of the women gasped politely. Vanessa nodded. "The property taxes alone on this place are over $60,000 a year. We might have to sell quickly." "Sell quickly." She said it while standing inside the home I personally designed room by room over 3 decades. The home where I painted walls myself because we could not afford contractors back then. The home where I wrapped Ethan's Christmas presents on the kitchen floor while Harold worked late trying to land investors. Yet now Vanessa spoke about selling it like she was discussing an old handbag she no longer wanted. Ethan joined the conversation, carrying a whiskey glass. "Dad kept too much tied up in the company," he said. "We need to figure out liquidity before things get complicated." Things get complicated. I almost smiled hearing my son repeat financial phrases he barely understood. Ethan had spent most of his adult life inside the company, but Harold never trusted him with real decisions. Not because he did not love him. Harold loved Ethan deeply, but Ethan had grown up with comfort, not hunger. He had never known what it felt like to choose between payroll and mortgage payments. He had never sat beside a kitchen table at 2 in the morning praying the bank would not foreclose before Friday. Vanessa glanced toward me, then lowered her voice further. "Margaret will probably need help adjusting after all this," she whispered. "I mean realistically, she cannot maintain this lifestyle alone." One woman asked quietly, "Did Harold leave her well protected?" Vanessa gave a small sympathetic shrug that made my stomach turn. "We honestly do not know yet." That was the moment I realized something important. They were not grieving Harold anymore. They were grieving access. Access to money. Access to status. Access to a life they assumed would continue flowing exactly as before. And because I wore an old wool coat instead of diamonds, because I sat quietly instead of demanding attention, because I allowed them to underestimate me for one single afternoon, they had already decided I was powerless. Then Ethan said something that finally made me look up from my coffee cup. "Once the lawyers sort things out," he muttered, "we may need to discuss smaller living arrangements for Mom." Smaller living arrangements. In my own house. I stayed quiet for the rest of the evening because grief has a strange way of sharpening old memories. Every cruel little comment inside that house seemed to pull me backward through time, back to years nobody in that living room would have survived. Around 9 o'clock, the caterers began clearing glasses while guests slowly collected coats and exchanged final hugs near the front door. Vanessa stood beside Ethan, thanking people for coming as though she owned the estate already. I watched her from the library doorway and suddenly remembered another winter night more than 40 years earlier when Harold and I sat inside a freezing one-bedroom apartment in Cleveland with exactly $11 left in our checking account. Ethan was 2 years old then. Harold had been trying to launch Whitmore Industrial Supply for almost a year, and every bank in Ohio had already rejected him twice. We could barely afford diapers. I used to drive 40 minutes each way to work at a dental office during the day, then spend nights typing invoices for Harold on a second-hand typewriter after Ethan fell asleep. Some nights we survived on canned soup because every extra dollar went into the business. Harold always believed the company would succeed. I believed in Harold. That was the difference. There were years when I worked harder than he did because somebody had to keep us alive while he chased contracts that never seemed to come through. I still remember removing my wedding ring in 1983 at a pawn shop downtown because payroll was due Friday morning and we were short $3,000. Harold cried in the car afterward because he thought he had failed us. 3 months later, we landed our first major manufacturing account. By 1998, when the recession nearly destroyed everything, I was the one who convinced Harold not to sell the company. I refinanced the house quietly without telling Ethan because I refused to let our employees lose their jobs before Christmas. 32 families depended on us back then. I knew every employee's spouse by name. I knew whose daughter needed surgery and whose son was applying to college. Whitmore Industrial Supply was never just Harold's business. It was our life, our marriage, our sacrifice. But people only remember the glamorous version of success after the money arrives. They forget the humiliation before the country club memberships and charity galas. They forget the woman packing sandwiches at 5 in the morning while balancing invoices at the kitchen counter. And children raised inside wealth almost never understand where it came from. Ethan certainly did not. By the time he joined the company, after college, the hard years were already over. He inherited polished conference rooms and luxury offices. He never saw me crying in grocery store parking lots trying to figure out which bills could wait another week. He never saw Harold collapse asleep at the dining room table still wearing his work boots. So now, standing inside the mansion those sacrifices built, Ethan genuinely believed his father had carried this family alone. Around 10:30, I walked upstairs to finally remove my heels when I heard voices drifting from the master bedroom down the hall. Vanessa was laughing softly. Honestly, she looked completely lost tonight, she whispered. I almost feel bad for her. Ethan sighed heavily. We just need to get through the legal stuff first. Then Vanessa said the one sentence that made me stop walking altogether. The sooner we transition her somewhere smaller, the easier this will be for everyone. Transition me somewhere smaller. Like I was old furniture that no longer matched the room. The next morning the house felt strangely lighter, as though grief itself had already packed its bags and left during the night. Sunlight poured through the massive kitchen windows, while staff quietly cleaned glasses and folded linens from the reception. Harold always loved mornings in this house. He used to stand near the coffee machine reading financial reports before anyone else woke up. For a moment, out of habit, I almost reached for the second coffee cup. Then reality settled back over me like cold rain. I poured only one cup and sat alone at the marble island listening to the distant sound of voices upstairs. Ethan and Vanessa were awake early. That alone told me everything. People only wake up before 8 in the morning after a funeral for 2 reasons: genuine grief or financial anxiety. And judging by the sharp little bursts of conversation drifting down the hallway, I knew exactly which one this was. Around 8:30, Vanessa entered the kitchen already dressed in cream slacks and a cashmere sweater that still had store creases near the sleeves. She stopped briefly when she saw me sitting there. "Oh," she said with polite surprise. "You are up." I looked at her over my coffee cup. "It is my kitchen." For a split second, something flashed across her face. Irritation, maybe. but it disappeared quickly beneath that same polished smile she wore for charity events and country club dinners. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I just meant you must be exhausted after yesterday." She opened the refrigerator and began speaking casually while slicing fruit onto a plate. "Ethan and I were talking last night about practical things moving forward." Practical things. Another soft, wealthy phrase that usually meant someone was about to lose something important. "This house is enormous for one person," she continued. "And honestly, Connecticut winters can be difficult at your age." At your age? There it was again. Every sentence wrapped in fake concern like poison hidden beneath frosting. I remained silent. Vanessa glanced toward me carefully before lowering her voice. "There are some beautiful luxury communities in Florida now. Full medical staff. Private dining. Social activities. You would actually love it." I almost laughed into my coffee. 3 days after burying my husband, my daughter-in-law was already shopping for a place to relocate me like an unwanted pet. Ethan finally entered the kitchen a moment later, looking tired and tense. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek before glancing toward me awkwardly. "Morning, Mom." "Good morning." He hesitated before sitting down across from me. "Listen," he began carefully, "we know this is a hard adjustment." Hard adjustment? I stared at my son and suddenly realized he sounded exactly like Vanessa now. Same careful tone. Same rehearsed compassion. "Your father handled a lot of complicated finances," he continued. "There are going to be major decisions ahead." I nodded slowly. "I am aware." Vanessa jumped in quickly. "We just think reducing stress right now would be healthiest for everyone." Healthiest for everyone. Not healthiest for me. For everyone. Meaning them. Meaning easier access to the estate. Easier control over the company. Easier management of the grieving old woman they assumed would quietly disappear if pressured politely enough. Then Ethan said the sentence that finally told me how far this had already gone behind closed doors. "The attorney is coming at noon," he explained. "We should all sit down together and review what Dad left behind." What Dad left behind. Not what our family built. Not what belonged to me too. What Dad left behind. And the saddest part was that Ethan truly believed he was being kind. At exactly noon, the front doorbell rang, and the entire mood inside the house shifted so quickly it almost felt theatrical. Ethan straightened his posture immediately. Vanessa smoothed invisible wrinkles from her sweater and exchanged a quick look with him before hurrying toward the foyer. They both looked nervous now, though neither of them understood why yet. I remained seated in the living room beside the fireplace with my hands folded quietly in my lap, while sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors Harold and I installed 25 years earlier after saving for nearly 18 months. A few seconds later, Richard entered carrying a leather briefcase thick enough to hold someone's entire future inside it. Richard Bennett had been our family attorney for over 3 decades. He had seen Ethan graduate high school. He had attended our Christmas parties. He had also watched Harold and me build Whitmore Industrial Supply from a struggling regional supplier into a company worth more money than most people in Connecticut would see in 10 lifetimes. "Margaret," he said gently when he saw me. His expression softened in a way that instantly contrasted with everyone else in the room. "I am deeply sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Richard." Ethan stepped forward quickly and shook his hand. "We appreciate you coming over so soon." Vanessa added a practiced little sigh. "Everything feels overwhelming right now." Richard nodded politely, but did not sit immediately. Instead, he placed the briefcase carefully onto the coffee table and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he asked calmly, "would you prefer we begin with the estate holdings or the corporate structures?" The room went silent. Vanessa blinked twice. Ethan frowned slightly like he did not fully understand the question. "Corporate structures?" he repeated. Richard looked mildly confused by Ethan's reaction. "Yes," he answered. "Given the size of the portfolio, I assumed your mother would want the overview handled efficiently." Portfolio. I noticed Vanessa glance at Ethan for a fraction of a second. Tiny crack number 1. Ethan cleared his throat awkwardly. "Dad never really discussed details with us." Richard slowly removed a stack of organized folders from the briefcase. "That is understandable," he replied. "Your father and mother preferred keeping most financial matters private." Preferred keeping financial matters private. That part was true. Harold used to joke that money attracted the wrong personalities faster than blood in shark-infested water. Looking around the living room at that exact moment, I realized he had not been joking at all. Richard handed me the first folder directly instead of placing it on the table for everyone. Vanessa noticed that immediately too. "Is there a copy for Ethan?" she asked carefully. Richard adjusted his glasses. "Eventually, certain summaries may be appropriate." "Certain summaries may be appropriate." Vanessa's smile stiffened almost invisibly. Ethan leaned forward. "I thought we were reviewing Dad's assets together." Richard looked genuinely surprised now. "Your father structured ownership very specifically many years ago." Then he turned another page calmly. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you like me to begin with the holding companies connected to the manufacturing division or the private investment accounts?" This time nobody spoke at all. Even the grandfather clock near the staircase suddenly seemed louder. Vanessa's entire posture changed beside Ethan. Not dramatic, just enough. Her shoulders tightened slightly. Her eyes sharpened. Predators recognize danger before ordinary people do. And for the very first time since Harold's funeral began, my daughter-in-law looked uncertain. Richard opened the first folder slowly, almost carefully, like a man who already understood the damage truth could cause inside families. Ethan leaned forward with both elbows on his knees while Vanessa crossed her legs tighter beside him. Her fingers wrapped around a glass of sparkling water she had stopped drinking several minutes earlier. I remained still in my chair near the fireplace, watching all of them with the strange calm that only arrives after disappointment has already done its worst. As Harold instructed, Richard began. All primary ownership records were consolidated 12 years ago during the company restructuring. Ethan nodded impatiently. "Okay." Richard adjusted his glasses again. At that time, Harold transferred controlling interest in Whitmore Industrial Supply, along with associated holding companies, to Margaret. Silence. Complete silence. Ethan stared at him blankly at first like he had misheard the sentence. Vanessa blinked once, then twice. "Transferred what exactly?" she asked carefully. Richard looked down at the documents. 91% ownership. I watched the color drain from Ethan's face so quickly it almost frightened me. "That cannot be right," he said immediately. "Dad owned the company." Richard gave him a sympathetic look people usually reserve for children hearing unpleasant adult realities. "Your father remained chief executive officer publicly," he explained. "But legal majority ownership has belonged to your mother since 2014. Vanessa finally set her glass down. "Why would he do that?" The answer to that question almost made me smile. "Because Harold trusted me more than anyone else on earth. Because I stood beside him before there was money, before there were investors, before people started pretending they loved him." Richard continued speaking calmly while turning pages. "In addition to the manufacturing division, Mrs. Whitmore controls the estate trust, the Connecticut property holdings, the North Carolina coastal investments, and the private portfolio accounts." Ethan looked at me now instead of Richard. "Mom," his voice sounded smaller suddenly. Younger somehow. "You knew about all this?" "Of course I did," I answered quietly. Vanessa shifted forward sharply. "Wait a second. You mean Margaret owns everything?" Richard corrected her immediately. "Not everything. There are charitable distributions and several educational trusts. But Mrs. Whitmore is sole controlling beneficiary over the majority of the estate." Sole controlling beneficiary. The words landed in the room like falling concrete. For 2 straight days they had spoken around me like I was some confused elderly woman surviving off Harold's generosity. Meanwhile, every chandelier above them, every painting on the walls, every luxury car in the driveway technically answered to me. Ethan rubbed his forehead hard. Dad never said anything. Richard looked directly at him. "Your father valued discretion." Discretion. Another word wealthy people use when they understand exactly how ugly entitlement becomes once money enters a room. Vanessa forced a nervous little laugh. "Well, obviously none of this changes the fact that we are family." Family. Interesting how quickly that word returned once she realized where the power actually lived. Richard opened another folder. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "would you like me to review current asset valuations?" I nodded once. Ethan stared at the floor, while Vanessa sat perfectly still beside him. Richard glanced down at the paperwork. "Based on the most recent quarterly evaluations, your combined holdings currently exceed $28 million. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I simply folded my hands in my lap and looked at the son and daughter-in-law who had spent the last 48 hours trying to relocate me out of my own life. The number hung in the air longer than anything else said that day. $28 million. It did not feel real at first, not even to me, even though I had lived every year that built it. I watched Ethan slowly lean back in his chair as if the air itself had become too heavy for him to hold upright. Vanessa did not speak. For the first time since I had known her, she had no immediate response prepared. Richard closed the folder gently, as though even paper now deserved respect. That figure reflects current valuation across all holdings, he said calmly, as if he were still speaking about something routine like tax filings. Ethan finally looked up. "Mom," he said again, but this time the word carried something different. Not entitlement, not assumption, confusion mixed with disbelief. "Why did Dad never tell us?" I took a slow breath. "Your father did not want money to change how people treated each other," I said quietly. Vanessa let out a small, nervous laugh that did not belong in the room. "Well, clearly that did not work," she said, then immediately regretted saying it out loud. Richard gathered the documents again, but he did not leave. He was waiting. Everyone understood that now. Waiting for instruction. Waiting for direction. Waiting for me. I stood up slowly from the chair near the fireplace. No one stopped me. No one spoke. I walked toward the center of the living room where the light from the tall windows fell across the hardwood floor. This was the same room where Vanessa had discussed smaller living arrangements for me less than 24 hours earlier. The irony felt almost quiet enough to hear. I turned slightly toward Ethan first. "You are my son," I said gently. He nodded immediately. Too quickly. "Yes." Then I looked at Vanessa. "And you are married into this family." She straightened her posture. "Yes," she said carefully. I let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. "For the past several days, I have listened to conversations about my future, my home, and my life as though I was not present." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa looked down at her hands. I continued speaking, still calm, still steady. "I understand grief affects people in different ways," I said. "But I also understand patterns when I see them." No one interrupted me. Not even Richard. I turned slightly toward the table where the documents were still open. "From this moment forward," I said, "all financial decisions related to Whitmore Industrial Supply and the estate will require my direct approval." Vanessa looked up quickly. "Of course," she said too fast. "We were never trying to exclude you." I nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them. "Additionally," I continued, "all personal allowances previously distributed through family accounts are suspended until further notice." Ethan frowned. "Mom, what does that mean?" I met his eyes. "It means I will decide how this family moves forward, not assumptions made in my absence." The room stayed silent. Again, but the atmosphere had changed. It no longer belonged to them. It no longer belonged to grief or speculation or polite control. It belonged to clarity. I looked at Richard. "Prepare full asset transfer confirmations and freeze any pending external authorizations until I review them." He nodded immediately. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore." Behind me, I heard Vanessa shift in her seat, suddenly unsure of where she stood, as if the ground beneath her understanding had disappeared. Ethan sat very still now, finally realizing that nothing he had planned for the next chapter of his life had any certainty left in it at all. The room did not move for a long time after I finished speaking. It was as if even the house itself needed a moment to adjust to a different kind of authority. Ethan remained seated with his hands resting loosely in front of him, staring at the floor as though it might provide answers that were no longer coming from anyone else in the room. Vanessa, on the other hand, sat perfectly still in a way that no longer looked composed. It looked controlled, carefully controlled fear disguised as silence. Richard began organizing the documents again without urgency, because now urgency belonged to someone else's permission. I turned away from the table and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the long driveway curved through the trees exactly as it had for decades, leading to a world that had always assumed it understood who held power inside this house. I could hear faint movement behind me, but no one spoke. That silence told me more than any argument ever could. People only become quiet like that when the story they built for themselves stops matching reality. After a moment, I spoke again without turning around. "Effective immediately," I said calmly. "No decisions will be made regarding property, company operations, or financial distribution without written authorization." Ethan finally lifted his head. "Mom, we are family," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. Not manipulation anymore. Not entitlement. Fear of losing everything he thought was stable. I turned slightly to look at him. Being family does not remove responsibility, I replied. Vanessa finally stood up, smoothing her hands down the sides of her sweater again, like she was trying to restore order through habit alone. We can work through this together, she said quickly, her voice softer now, less certain. I nodded once. We will, I answered, but under new terms. Richard closed the final folder and stepped back slightly. I will prepare formal documentation for immediate restructuring review, he said. I gave a small nod of approval. The professionalism in his voice was comforting in a way that emotion no longer could be. Moments later, I walked out of the living room and down the hallway that led toward the front entrance. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. The sound of my footsteps on the polished floor felt steady, measured, final. Behind me, I heard Ethan stand up, as if he wanted to say something, but no words followed. Vanessa did not follow at all. That told me